The morning fog lifted slowly over the streets of Philadelphia in the autumn of 1871. The air carried the weight of something ancient, something that the city's newest residents could not name but instinctively felt. Among the grand buildings that lined Broad Street, there stood structures so magnificent, so impossibly detailed, that the official explanation for their construction seemed almost laughable to those who paused long enough to truly observe them. Marcus Webb was one such observer. At 43 years of age, Marcus had spent the better part of his adult life working as a restoration architect. His hands had touched the stones of countless buildings across the eastern seaboard, and his eyes had learned to read the silent language that old structures spoke to those patient enough to listen. But nothing in his considerable experience had prepared him for what he would discover in the basement archives of Philadelphia's City Hall, a building that, according to official records, was still under construction, yet whose foundations told an entirely different story. The morning had begun like any other. Marcus arrived at his modest office on Chestnut Street just as the clock tower struck 7. His assistant, a young man named Thomas Ashford, was already sorting through the day's correspondence when Marcus pushed open the heavy wooden door. "There's a letter from the municipal council," Thomas announced, his voice carrying the particular excitement of youth encountering the unknown. "They want you to assess the structural integrity of the old wing." Marcus took the envelope and studied the official seal. The request was straightforward enough, a routine inspection of foundation work that had supposedly been completed decades earlier. Yet something in the wording gave him pause. The letter specifically mentioned pre-existing structural elements that needed to be integrated with the new construction. Pre-existing elements in a building that was supposedly being built from scratch. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his coat pocket. "Tell them I'll begin this afternoon." The journey to City Hall took Marcus through streets that seemed to exist in two temporal states simultaneously. On the surface, Philadelphia was a city of progress. Horse-drawn carriages clattered over cobblestones, gas lamps lined the major thoroughfares, and everywhere the sounds of industry announced the arrival of a new era. But beneath this veneer of modernity, Marcus could see the older city, the one that seemed to have been there long before anyone could remember building it. He noticed it in the way certain cornerstones bore weathering patterns inconsistent with their supposed age. He saw it in the geometric precision of window placements that no contemporary craftsman could replicate. Most of all, he felt it in the strange acoustic properties of certain buildings, the way sound traveled through their corridors as if following invisible pathways designed for purposes no one could explain. City Hall loomed before him, a monument of white marble and granite that rose toward the gray October sky. The official narrative held that construction had begun in 1871 and would continue for another 30 years. Yet as Marcus approached the eastern entrance, he found himself confronting a paradox that would define the next several years of his life. The foundation stones were old. Not merely weathered or prematurely aged by environmental factors, they were genuinely, impossibly ancient. The tool marks on their surfaces belonged to no technique employed in the 19th century. The mortar between them had achieved a crystalline hardness that modern chemistry could not explain. And carved into the deepest blocks, hidden from casual observation, were symbols that Marcus had seen only once before, in a forbidden book of architectural mysteries that his mentor had shown him decades earlier, just before that mentor had vanished without explanation. Marcus descended into the basement levels, his lantern casting dancing shadows across walls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The air grew cooler with each step, and a low hum began to make itself known, not heard so much as felt, a vibration that traveled through the stone and into his bones. The official construction crews had not yet penetrated this deep. According to the plans, these lower chambers did not exist, yet here they were, vast and silent, waiting to be rediscovered by anyone brave or foolish enough to look. He found the first chamber 30 feet below street level. The ceiling rose in a perfect dome, its surface covered with geometric patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. At the center of the room stood a pillar of dark stone, polished to a mirror finish, reflecting Marcus's lantern light in ways that violated every optical principle he understood. "What were you?" he whispered to the empty chamber, his voice echoing in patterns that should have been acoustically impossible. What civilization built you, and why has no one spoken your name? The silence that answered was not empty. It was weighted with secrets, pregnant with revelations that the modern world had been systematically taught to ignore. Marcus understood in that moment that he stood at the threshold of a discovery that would either transform his understanding of history or destroy everything he thought he knew about the world. He pulled out his notebook and began to sketch. The symbols on the walls followed a consistent grammar, not random decorations, but a language of form and proportion that communicated something profound to anyone who possessed the key to read it. Marcus did not possess that key, not yet, but he recognized the structure of meaning when he saw it. Hours passed unnoticed. When he finally emerged from the basement levels, the sun had set and the gas lamps had been lit along the surrounding streets. Thomas was waiting for him at the entrance, concern evident in his young face. "Sir, you've been down there for nearly 8 hours. We were about to send for help." Marcus looked at his assistant as if seeing him for the first time. 8 hours. It had felt like minutes. Something in those underground chambers had altered his perception of time itself. "Thomas," he said slowly, weighing each word before speaking it. "What do you know about the buildings of this city? Not what the records say. What do you actually know?" The young man's confusion was genuine. "I know what everyone knows, sir. They were built by the city founders, by skilled craftsmen and architects working according to approved plans. And if I told you that some of these buildings predate any construction records, that their foundations exist on maps that were supposedly drawn before the land was surveyed, what would you say to that?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "I would say that there must be an error in the records, sir. That's what I would have said too. Once." Marcus began walking toward his office, his mind already cataloging the questions that demanded answers. "But errors accumulate in one direction, Thomas. Random mistakes scatter randomly. What I've seen suggests something far more systematic, a deliberate obscuring of origins, a rewriting of architectural history on a scale I cannot yet comprehend." That night, Marcus sat alone in his study, surrounded by books and documents that suddenly seemed inadequate to explain the reality he had witnessed. His lamp burned low as he wrote the first entry in what would become a journal of impossible discoveries. October 17th, 1871. Today, I descended into a chamber that does not exist. I touched stones that predate their supposed construction by centuries. I saw symbols that belong to no known culture, yet display a sophistication that exceeds anything we are capable of producing today. The question is no longer whether these structures are what they appear to be. The question is why we have been taught to see them as something they are not. He paused, his pen hovering over the page. In the distance, he could hear the bells of a nearby church marking the midnight hour. But beneath that familiar sound, almost lost in the threshold of perception, was something else. A resonance that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath the city, as if the ground itself remembered a frequency that modern ears had forgotten how to hear. Marcus closed his journal and extinguished his lamp. Tomorrow he would begin the systematic investigation that would consume the next decade of his life. He would trace the origins of buildings that officially had no origins. He would document technologies that officially did not exist. And he would slowly, methodically piece together a story that powerful interests had spent generations trying to erase. But that night, in the darkness of his study, Marcus Webb could only marvel at the magnitude of what he had stumbled upon. Somewhere beneath the cities of America, beneath the factories and the churches and the homes of ordinary citizens, lay the ruins of something magnificent, something that had been hidden, deliberately and systematically, from human knowledge. The architecture of the forgotten world was waiting to be remembered, and Marcus had just taken the first step into its silent, patient embrace. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Stories like this one, stories that challenge everything we think we know about our past, are waiting to be discovered. Subscribe now and join the investigation into the hidden history that surrounds us all. 3 months had passed since Marcus Webb's first descent into the impossible chambers beneath Philadelphia's City Hall. In that time, his investigation had expanded in directions he could never have anticipated. What began as architectural curiosity had transformed into something approaching obsession, a systematic mapping of anomalies that existed in plain sight, visible to anyone who knew how to look, yet invisible to a world that had been conditioned not to see. His office on Chestnut Street had become a repository of evidence. Maps covered every available wall surface, their surfaces marked with colored pins that indicated locations where the official historical record contradicted the physical reality of existing structures. Photographs, that marvelous new technology that promised to capture truth in silver and light, lay scattered across his desk, each image documenting architectural details that defied conventional explanation. Thomas Ashford had proven himself an invaluable assistant, his initial skepticism gradually giving way to the same uncomfortable conviction that had seized Marcus. Together, they had developed a methodology for identifying what Marcus had come to call origin anomalies, structural evidence that buildings existed before they were supposedly built. The methodology was simple but effective. They would obtain official construction records for a given building, noting the dates of foundation laying, structural completion, and final finishing. Then they would examine the physical structure itself, looking for weathering patterns, material compositions, and architectural techniques that contradicted the documented timeline. Finally, they would search for any historical photographs or drawings that depicted the building before its official construction date. The results were disturbing in their consistency. Building after building revealed the same pattern. Official records claimed one origin, while physical evidence suggested another. The discrepancies were not minor. They represented gaps of decades, sometimes centuries, between documented construction and apparent actual age. It's as if someone went through the historical record with a brush, Thomas observed one evening, studying a photograph of Philadelphia's Academy of Music, painting over what was already there and claiming credit for the creation. Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the image. The Academy had officially opened in 1857, yet the photograph in his hands, obtained from a private collection with a documented provenance dating to 1849, showed the same building standing complete, its facade identical in every detail. The question, Marcus replied, is not whether this was done. The evidence makes that clear. The question is who did it, how they accomplished it on such a scale, and why. The breakthrough came in February of 1872, through a connection that Marcus had not anticipated. He received a letter from a woman named Eleanor Sinclair, a private collector of historical documents who had heard of his inquiries through mutual acquaintances. Her letter was brief and intriguing. She possessed a collection of maps that she believed would interest him, maps that had been in her family for generations, but that she had never been able to reconcile with accepted geography. Marcus traveled to her estate in the countryside outside Boston on a day when snow lay thick on the ground and the sky was the color of old pewter. Eleanor was a woman in her late 60s, sharp-eyed and deliberate in her movements, clearly accustomed to being underestimated by men who assumed her age, and gender indicated limited intelligence. "My grandfather was a surveyor," she explained, as she led Marcus through the corridors of her home toward a private library. He worked for various government agencies before and after the Civil War. These maps were among his personal effects when he passed in 1865. I've never known what to make of them. The library was modest in size, but exceptional in content. Shelves lined 3 walls, filled with books and documents that represented generations of accumulated knowledge. Eleanor directed Marcus to a large table in the center of the room, upon which lay a collection of rolled and folded papers. "These are the maps I mentioned," she said, carefully unrolling the first document. "They're dated 1847, which is consistent with my grandfather's early career. But look at what they show." Marcus bent over the map, his breath catching in his throat as he recognized the geography. It was the eastern seaboard of the United States, but not the eastern seaboard he knew from any contemporary atlas. Cities appeared in their correct locations, but their layouts were different. Building footprints that should not have existed for decades were clearly marked. And most remarkably, a network of lines connected major population centers, lines that were labeled in a notation system Marcus did not recognize. "These buildings," he said slowly, tracing his finger across the map. "They match the structures I've been documenting, the ones that appear to predate their official construction." Eleanor nodded. "I've compared them to current city plans. The correspondence is exact. Whatever these maps represent, they show our cities as they existed before they were supposedly built. Or as they were planned to exist," Marcus countered, his mind racing through possibilities. "These could be architectural projections, designs for future construction." "I considered that explanation, but look here." Eleanor unrolled a second map, this one showing the same region but with additional detail. "This is dated 1843. It shows the same buildings, but with annotations indicating structural damage. These notes describe repair work needed on buildings that, according to official records, would not be constructed for another 20 years. The implication was staggering. These maps did not show planned construction. They showed existing infrastructure that had somehow been erased from official memory and then rebuilt or repurposed under the guise of new construction. Marcus spent 3 days in Eleanor's library, systematically photographing and transcribing every document in her collection. The maps told a story that contradicted everything he had been taught about American history. A story of advanced infrastructure that existed before the colonial period, of cities and networks that predated European settlement, of a civilization that had left its mark across the continent before vanishing from all official record. "My grandfather never spoke of what he saw," Eleanor told Marcus on the evening before his departure. "He was a meticulous man, a scientist in temperament if not in title. For him to keep these documents hidden, to never reference them in his professional work, he must have had a reason. He must have known that some truths are too dangerous to speak." Marcus returned to Philadelphia with copies of Eleanor's maps and a new framework for understanding his discoveries. The anomalies he had been documenting were not random errors or isolated frauds. They were evidence of a systematic program of historical revision, a deliberate effort to erase the memory of a preceding civilization and replace it with a narrative of recent construction. The scale of this program was almost incomprehensible. It would have required coordination across multiple agencies, the cooperation of countless individuals, and a consistency of purpose that spanned generations. Yet the evidence suggested that precisely such a program had been implemented and that its results surrounded him every day in the form of buildings whose true origins had been systematically obscured. In March, Marcus began the next phase of his investigation. If the maps were accurate, the network of lines connecting major cities represented some form of infrastructure, transportation, communication, or something else entirely. He would attempt to locate physical evidence of this network, starting with the connection the maps indicated between Philadelphia and New York. His journey took him through landscapes that revealed their secrets reluctantly. Along the route the maps suggested, he found evidence of old roadbeds that appeared on no current survey. He discovered stone foundations in isolated locations, too sophisticated in their construction to be the work of colonial settlers, too systematically placed to be natural formations. And in a wooded valley halfway between the two cities, he encountered something that made him question whether he truly understood what he was investigating. It was a structure, though that word seemed inadequate to describe it. Rising from the forest floor was a series of stone pillars, each perhaps 30 feet tall, arranged in a geometric pattern that extended beyond Marcus's ability to see through the dense vegetation. The pillars were covered with symbols similar to those he had seen in the chambers beneath City Hall, and they hummed with the same barely perceptible vibration. Marcus approached the nearest pillar and placed his palm against its surface. The stone was warm despite the spring chill, and beneath his touch he could feel a pulsation like a slow heartbeat. The hum intensified as he made contact, rising to a frequency that seemed to resonate in the bones of his skull. He stepped back, suddenly aware of how alone he was in this place, how far from any help if something were to go wrong. The rational part of his mind insisted that there must be a natural explanation: geothermal activity, unusual mineral compositions, acoustic properties of the surrounding terrain. But the rational part of his mind was growing quieter with each new discovery, crowded out by the accumulating evidence that the world was not what he had been taught it was. Marcus documented the site carefully, sketching the pillars and their symbols, measuring distances and angles, photographing what his camera could capture in the dim forest light. He would return with equipment and assistance, he decided. This location would become a focus of his investigation, a physical link between the maps in Eleanor's library and the impossible chambers beneath Philadelphia. But as he made his way back through the forest, Marcus could not shake the feeling that he was being watched. Not by any human observer, he had checked carefully for that, but by something else. Something that resided in the stones themselves, something that had been waiting for generations to be rediscovered. The investigation was advancing more rapidly than he had anticipated. But with each new discovery, Marcus felt less like an investigator and more like a participant in something far larger than himself. The forgotten world was not merely waiting to be remembered. It was actively calling to those who could hear it, drawing them toward a truth that would change everything they thought they knew. And Marcus Webb was beginning to realize that once you heard that call, there was no way to unhear it. Summer arrived in Philadelphia with a heat that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. The streets shimmered under an oppressive sun, and the citizens sought refuge in the shade of buildings that, Marcus now understood, were far older than anyone acknowledged. His investigation had entered a new phase, one that moved beyond documentation into active experimentation. The discovery in the forest had changed his approach. Those pillars, with their warmth and their vibration, suggested that the forgotten infrastructure was not merely architectural but functional. The network indicated on Eleanor's maps was not simply a series of roads or communication lines. It was something more fundamental, a system that appeared to harness forces that contemporary science did not recognize. Marcus had recruited 2 additional investigators to assist with this phase of his work. The first was Dr. Samuel Chen, a physicist at the University of Pennsylvania who had been dismissed from his position after publishing a paper on acoustic anomalies that his colleagues found too speculative. The second was Rebecca Thornton, a young woman who worked as a telegraph operator and had developed an almost preternatural sensitivity to electromagnetic phenomena. Together, the 4 of them, Marcus, Thomas, Samuel, and Rebecca, formed an unlikely team, united by their willingness to question accepted reality. They met in Marcus's office on a July evening when the heat had finally begun to release its grip on the city. "The pillars in the forest," Samuel began, spreading his notes across Marcus's desk, "exhibit properties that I cannot explain using any accepted physical theory. The vibration frequency is consistent and stable, not random oscillation that might result from wind or geological activity. It's as if the stones themselves are generating a signal." "A signal to whom?" Thomas asked. "Or to what?" "That's the question I've been working on." Samuel produced a diagram showing the geometric arrangement of the pillars. "The pattern corresponds to specific mathematical ratios that appear repeatedly in sacred architecture across multiple cultures. But more significantly, when I map the acoustic properties of the arrangement, I find evidence of resonance points, locations where vibrations from multiple pillars would converge and amplify." Rebecca leaned forward, her eyes bright with recognition. "I've felt something similar in certain buildings. When I'm working the telegraph, there are places where the signal seems stronger, clearer, places where the electromagnetic field behaves differently than it should." "Show me," Marcus said, retrieving one of Eleanor's maps from his files. "Mark those locations." Rebecca studied the map, then began placing small marks at various points throughout the city. When she finished, Marcus felt a chill despite the lingering heat. Her marks corresponded almost exactly to the network lines indicated on the original map, a network that had been drawn decades before the telegraph system was constructed. "The infrastructure already existed," Marcus said slowly, the realization crystallizing in his mind. "Whatever system the telegraph uses, it's drawing on something that was already in place. We didn't create a new network. We connected to an old one." The implications of this insight guided their research over the following weeks. They began systematic measurements throughout the city, documenting electromagnetic anomalies, acoustic properties, and structural details that might indicate the presence of the ancient network. What they found was a hidden layer of technology integrated so seamlessly into the urban landscape that it had become invisible. Certain buildings acted as nodes in this network, their foundations extending deep into the earth and constructed with materials that conducted or amplified unknown energies. Streets and thoroughfares followed alignments that corresponded to the mathematical ratios Samuel had identified, creating corridors of enhanced resonance. And beneath everything, barely perceptible but consistently present, was the hum that Marcus had first noticed in the chambers below City Hall, a fundamental frequency that seemed to underlie the entire system. In August, they made their most significant discovery. Following the network lines to their apparent convergence point, they found themselves at a location that Marcus had passed countless times without truly seeing it: the intersection of Broad Street and Market Street, the precise center of William Penn's original city plan. Penn's plan was not original, Thomas observed as they stood at the intersection, surrounded by the bustle of ordinary city life. He was working from something older. The grid, the dimensions, the placement of major structures, it all corresponds to the patterns we've been documenting. Marcus nodded. The evidence was overwhelming. Philadelphia had not been planned in the 17th century. It had been rediscovered. The city that William Penn claimed to have designed already existed, its foundations waiting beneath the surface to be built upon and claimed as new creation. But it was Samuel who made the connection that would direct their investigation forward. If this location is a convergence point, he said, then there should be a mechanism here, something that receives or transmits whatever energy the network carries. They began searching, looking for anything that might indicate the presence of such a mechanism. The search took them through basements and subterranean passages, through utility tunnels that had been constructed without official records, through spaces that existed in the gaps between official maps, and finally, in a chamber that appeared on no architectural plan, they found it. It was a structure unlike anything Marcus had seen in his years of investigating impossible architecture. At the center of a circular chamber, perhaps 50 feet in diameter, stood a crystalline formation that rose from the floor to nearly touch the domed ceiling above. The crystal was not natural. Its facets were too precise, its geometry too regular. But neither did it appear to be manufactured by any technique Marcus could identify. The formation pulsed with a soft light that seemed to come from within, and the hum that permeated the network was concentrated here into something almost audible, a low tone that resonated in the chest and seemed to communicate directly with the nervous system. Rebecca was the first to approach the crystal. Her sensitivity to electromagnetic phenomena drew her forward, as if responding to a call. As she neared the formation, the pulsing intensified, and she began to speak in a voice that did not quite sound like her own. "The network is intact," she said, her eyes fixed on the crystal's depths. "Dormant, but intact. It's waiting to be activated, waiting for the frequencies that were silenced when the old world was erased." "What frequencies?" Marcus demanded. "What would activate it?" "Sound," Rebecca replied. "Specific tones, specific harmonics. The buildings above us were designed to generate these frequencies when wind passed through their towers and steeples. But the modifications made during reconstruction changed the acoustic properties. The tones that once activated the network were muted, replaced by frequencies that do nothing." She stepped back from the crystal, and the pulsing gradually subsided. When she turned to face the others, her expression was troubled. "We've been living in a machine we don't understand," she said. "A machine that was deliberately disabled by people who feared its power." The discovery in the chamber transformed the scope of their investigation. They were no longer simply documenting anomalies or mapping forgotten infrastructure. They were attempting to understand a technology that surpassed anything the 19th century had produced. And they were beginning to glimpse the outline of a conspiracy that had operated across centuries, systematically erasing the memory of a civilization that had once possessed capabilities beyond modern imagination. The team began documenting everything: the crystal's dimensions, its response to various stimuli, its relationship to the network of pillars and conductors that spread throughout the city. They brought instruments that Samuel had designed to measure electromagnetic fields and acoustic properties, recording data that would form the foundation of their eventual report. But they also took precautions. The chamber's location was kept secret, shared only among the four of them. Their notes were encoded using a cipher that Marcus developed based on the symbols found throughout the forgotten architecture, and they varied their routes and schedules, aware that their activities might attract attention from those who had worked so hard to keep these secrets buried. It was during one of these documentation sessions, in late September, that Marcus first noticed they were being watched. A figure observed from the shadows of a connecting tunnel, a man in dark clothing who vanished the moment Marcus turned toward him. The encounter lasted only seconds, but it confirmed what Marcus had suspected. Their investigation had not gone unnoticed. "We need to accelerate our timeline," he told the team that evening. "Whatever we're going to find, we need to find it soon. Others know what we're doing, and I doubt they intend to let us continue indefinitely." The pressure of time drove them to take risks they might otherwise have avoided. They expanded their search to other cities, following the network lines to New York, Boston, and Washington. In each location, they found the same pattern: ancient foundations beneath modern buildings, acoustic chambers hidden in basements, and evidence of a technology that had been systematically suppressed. In Washington, they discovered something that elevated their understanding to a new level. Beneath the Capitol building, that monument to democratic ideals supposedly constructed in the early 19th century, lay a chamber even larger than the one in Philadelphia. And at its center stood not a crystal, but something that appeared to be a mechanism of incredible sophistication, a device of interlocking geometric forms, suspended in a field of energy that Marcus could see as a faint shimmer in the air. "This is the heart of the network," Samuel whispered, his voice awed. "Not just a node, but a control center. Whatever the network was designed to do, it was directed from here." The mechanism was dormant, like the crystal in Philadelphia, but its complexity suggested capabilities that Marcus could barely imagine. Gears that seemed to turn without physical connection, crystals that refracted light in impossible ways, and everywhere, the symbols that had become their guide to this hidden world, a language of form and proportion that communicated meaning across the centuries. Rebecca approached the mechanism with the same drawn expression she had shown in Philadelphia. But this time, when she reached out to touch it, her hand passed through the shimmer of energy and made contact with the central assembly. The chamber exploded with light. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Marcus saw the network as it was meant to function. He saw energy flowing along invisible lines, connecting cities and structures across the entire continent. He saw the mechanism directing this energy, distributing it according to patterns that corresponded to natural cycles, lunar phases, seasonal changes, solar activity. And he saw what the network had been designed to do: to harmonize human civilization with the fundamental rhythms of the Earth itself. Then the vision faded, and they were standing in darkness, the mechanism once again dormant, its secrets locked behind whatever barrier had been erected generations ago. "We need to tell people," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "We need to share what we've found." But Marcus, still processing what he had witnessed, understood that the decision was not so simple. The knowledge they possessed was dangerous, not because it was false, but because it was true. The forces that had suppressed this technology would not hesitate to suppress those who tried to reveal it. And the technology itself, if reactivated without understanding, might prove more destructive than beneficial. "We need to understand before we reveal," Marcus replied. "We need to know why this was hidden, who hid it, and what they feared would happen if it was rediscovered. If you're still watching, if you feel the pull of this mystery as Marcus and his team felt it in that hidden chamber, leave a comment saying, 'The resonance calls to those ready to hear.' Let us know that you're part of this journey of discovery, that you understand what's at stake when hidden truths begin to emerge." October brought the first frost to Philadelphia, and with it a change in the nature of Marcus Webb's investigation. The discovery beneath the Capitol had convinced him that he was dealing not merely with forgotten technology, but with a secret that someone, or some group, had deliberately worked to suppress. The figure he had glimpsed in the tunnel, the sense of being watched that had grown stronger with each passing week, the subtle obstacles that seemed to appear whenever their research advanced too quickly, all of this pointed to an organized opposition. The question was, who were they, and what did they want? The answer began to emerge through a series of seemingly unconnected events that Marcus later realized had been orchestrated to deliver a message. First, a fire at the University of Pennsylvania destroyed the laboratory where Samuel had been analyzing samples from the chambers. The fire was ruled accidental, but Marcus noted that only Samuel's equipment and notes were affected, leaving adjacent research materials untouched. Second, Rebecca received a visit from government officials who questioned her about her work with the telegraph company, asking specifically about any anomalous readings she might have observed. Third, Thomas was approached by a stranger who offered him a substantial sum of money to abandon his work with Marcus and relocate to California. These events were warnings, Marcus understood, but they were also intelligence. Someone knew exactly what they were doing and wanted them to know they were being observed. The tactics were those of an organization confident in its power, one that preferred intimidation to violence, at least for now. Marcus decided to force the issue. If his adversaries wanted to communicate, he would give them an opportunity. He published a letter in the Scientific American, ostensibly a theoretical piece on acoustic architecture, but containing references that anyone familiar with his investigation would recognize. He was announcing himself, inviting contact, accepting whatever consequences might follow. The response came more quickly than he anticipated. 3 days after the letter's publication, Marcus arrived at his office to find a sealed envelope on his desk. Inside was a single card, embossed with a symbol he had seen repeatedly in his investigations. A geometric pattern that combined D-circles, triangles, and spirals in a configuration that suggested both astronomical observation and something more esoteric. On the reverse of the card was an address and a time, midnight, 3 days hence. Marcus shared the invitation with his team, and they debated whether to accept. The risks were obvious. This could be a trap, an opportunity for their adversaries to silence them permanently. But the potential reward was equally significant: direct contact with whatever organization had been working to suppress the knowledge they sought. In the end, Marcus decided to go alone. If this was a trap, there was no reason to endanger the others. And if it was a genuine invitation to dialogue, his presence alone would be sufficient. The address led to a building in the oldest part of the city, a structure that Marcus recognized immediately as one of the anomalous sites he had documented months earlier. Its foundations predated any colonial construction, and its interior contained acoustic properties that marked it as part of the ancient network. He arrived at midnight and found the door unlocked. Inside, a single lamp illuminated a circular chamber, not unlike the hidden rooms he had discovered beneath the modern city, but smaller, more intimate. Seated in chairs arranged around the perimeter were 7 figures, their faces obscured by shadow. "Mr. Webb," said a voice from the darkness. "We've been expecting you for some time. Please, sit." Marcus took the remaining chair, acutely aware that he was surrounded and unarmed. But the voice that had spoken carried no threat, only a weary authority that suggested long experience with conversations like this one. "You know who we are," the voice continued. It was not a question. "I know what you've done," Marcus replied. "You've hidden the truth about our cities, our history, our technology. You've rewritten the past to conceal a civilization that existed before our own." A soft murmur passed through the assembled figures. Then the voice spoke again, and Marcus detected something unexpected in its tone: sadness. "You understand the what, Mr. Webb, but not the why. That is why we've brought you here, not to silence you, but to educate you, and then to offer you a choice." Over the next several hours, Marcus listened as the figures revealed the history that had been erased from public memory. They called themselves the Keepers, and they had existed in various forms for centuries, their purpose unchanged across generations: to manage the transition between the old world and the new. The civilization that had built the network, they did not call it Tartaria, though they acknowledged that name had been used, had achieved a level of technological sophistication that modern society could barely imagine. Their cities had been powered by the energy of the earth itself, channeled through the crystalline network that Marcus had discovered. Their architecture had been designed to harmonize human consciousness with natural frequencies, promoting health, creativity, and spiritual development. But that civilization had also contained the seeds of its own destruction. The same technology that could heal could also harm. The same energy that could illuminate could also devastate. And when a faction within that civilization had attempted to weaponize the network, the result had been catastrophic. The event you might call a reset, the voice explained, was not natural. It was the consequence of misused power. Cities were destroyed in moments, millions perished. And those who survived faced a choice: rebuild with the same technology and risk repeating the catastrophe, or suppress the knowledge and begin again. They chose suppression, Marcus said. They chose survival. The technology was not destroyed. That would have been impossible. But it was disabled, hidden, and the memory of it was systematically erased. New narratives were created to explain the structures that remained. New histories were written to account for the foundations that could not be removed, and organizations like ours were established to maintain the suppression across generations. Marcus sat in silence, processing what he had heard. The scale of the deception was staggering, but so was the reasoning behind it. If the technology could indeed be weaponized, if its misuse had already caused one catastrophe, then perhaps the keepers were not villains but guardians, flawed perhaps in their methods, but sincere in their purpose. "Why tell me this?" he finally asked. "Why not simply silence me, as you've silenced others?" "Because the suppression is failing," another voice answered, female, younger than the first. "The old structures are being rediscovered. The network is beginning to reactivate on its own, responding to changes in the Earth's electromagnetic field that we cannot control. Within a generation, perhaps less, the technology will become impossible to hide. And when that happens," the first voice continued, "humanity will face the same choice our predecessors faced: use the technology wisely or destroy themselves with it. We believe that the outcome depends on preparation, on having people who understand both the potential and the danger." The offer, when it came, was not what Marcus had expected. They did not ask him to join the Keepers or to abandon his investigation. Instead, they asked him to continue, but with a fuller understanding of what he was dealing with. "Document everything," the voice instructed. "Build a record that will survive us, that will be available when the knowledge can no longer be suppressed. But do so carefully, Mr. Webb. The world is not yet ready for the full truth. It must be revealed gradually, in ways that allow understanding to develop alongside awareness." Marcus left the meeting as dawn was breaking over Philadelphia. His mind was crowded with new information, new questions, and a new sense of purpose. The investigation would continue, but its nature had changed. He was no longer simply uncovering a hidden past. He was preparing for a future that would require humanity to confront powers it had forgotten it possessed. The years that followed Marcus Webb's meeting with the Keepers were marked by patient, methodical work. He continued his documentation of anomalous architecture, but now with a deeper understanding of what he was recording. Each discovery was placed within the framework the Keepers had provided, building a comprehensive picture of the forgotten civilization and its technology. His team remained intact, though their roles evolved. Samuel Chen developed instruments capable of measuring the subtle energies that flowed through the network, creating a scientific vocabulary for phenomena that had previously defied description. Rebecca Thornton refined her sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, becoming able to locate network nodes with remarkable precision. And Thomas Ashford proved invaluable as a researcher, tracking down historical documents that corroborated the Keeper's account of the suppression. Together, they mapped the network across the eastern United States, identifying major nodes, tracing connection lines, and documenting the acoustic and electromagnetic properties of each site. The work was painstaking and often dangerous, not from the Keepers, who honored their agreement to allow the investigation to continue, but from the network itself, which seemed to respond to their presence in ways that were not always benign. In the spring of 1875, they experienced the first significant activation event. While conducting measurements in the chamber beneath Philadelphia, the crystalline formation suddenly flared with light, and the hum that permeated the network rose to an audible frequency. For several minutes, the team witnessed the system operating as it had been designed to function, energy flowing through the crystal, patterns of light forming in the air, and a sensation of profound well-being that seemed to emanate from the activated structure. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the activation ceased. The crystal returned to its dormant state, and the hum subsided to its usual, barely perceptible level. "Something triggered that," Samuel said, checking his instruments. "An external input, possibly astronomical. The timing corresponds to a particular alignment that occurs only once every several decades." The activation event convinced Marcus that the Keeper's warning was accurate. The network was indeed beginning to reawaken, responding to cosmic cycles that human suppression could not affect. The question was no longer whether the technology would be rediscovered, but when, and whether humanity would be prepared to use it responsibly. Marcus accelerated his documentation efforts, working with a sense of urgency that sometimes alarmed his colleagues. He began preparing a comprehensive report that would explain the network, its history, and its potential, intended for eventual publication when the time was right. The report grew to hundreds of pages, incorporating everything they had learned: the architectural evidence, the measurements, the historical analysis, and the testimony of the Keepers themselves. But even as he worked, Marcus was aware that forces beyond his control were shaping events. The Industrial Revolution was transforming the landscape, and with each new factory, each new railroad line, the energy patterns of the Earth were being altered. The network, designed to work in harmony with natural systems, was being subjected to interference from technologies that operated on entirely different principles. In 1878, Marcus observed something that filled him with both hope and concern. In cities across the country, individuals were beginning to notice the anomalies he had spent years documenting. Architects questioned the origins of buildings they were hired to modify. Historians discovered contradictions in official records. And ordinary citizens, walking through streets they had traveled countless times, suddenly perceived the strangeness that had been hiding in plain sight. The awakening was not limited to the network. It was happening in human consciousness as well. Marcus Webb completed his comprehensive report in the autumn of 1880, 9 years after his first descent into the chambers beneath Philadelphia. The document ran to over 400 pages and represented the most complete account of the forgotten civilization and its technology that had ever been assembled. He did not publish it. Following the guidance of the Keepers, he arranged for the report to be preserved in multiple locations, accessible to those who sought it, but not advertised to the general public. The time for full disclosure had not yet arrived, but when it did, the information would be available. In the years that followed, Marcus watched as the world continued to change in ways that both fulfilled and contradicted his expectations. The Industrial Revolution proceeded unchecked, transforming the landscape and the society in ways that increasingly alienated humanity from the natural systems the network had been designed to harmonize with. Yet at the same time, a counter-current was developing, a growing interest in the mysterious, the unexplained, the evidence that the official story of human civilization was incomplete. His team dispersed gradually, each member carrying the knowledge they had gained into new endeavors. Samuel Chen established a private laboratory where he continued his research into unconventional energy systems. Rebecca Thornton became one of the first women to achieve prominence in the emerging field of electrical engineering, her sensitivity to electromagnetic phenomena guiding innovations that her colleagues could not explain. And Thomas Ashford entered academia, where he quietly influenced generations of students to question accepted historical narratives. Marcus himself withdrew from active investigation, though he never stopped observing. From his study in Philadelphia, he watched the city grow and change, noting how the ancient patterns persisted beneath the modern surface. He corresponded with the Keepers, receiving periodic updates on the network status and the progress of the gradual awakening they had predicted. In his final years, Marcus often walked the streets of the city he had come to understand so deeply. He would pause at certain corners, certain buildings, certain intersections where the energy of the network was particularly strong, and he would listen for the hum that had first drawn him into this investigation decades earlier. It was still there, patient and persistent, waiting for the day when humanity would be ready to hear it again. Marcus Webb passed away in 1892, his work largely unknown to the public, but preserved by those who understood its significance. He left behind not only his comprehensive report, but also a journal spanning more than 20 years, a record of one man's journey from conventional architect to guardian of forbidden knowledge. The final entry in that journal, written just days before his death, captured the essence of what he had learned and what he hoped for the future. I have spent my life documenting a truth that the world was not ready to receive. I have walked in chambers that should not exist, touched technologies that exceed our understanding, and glimpsed a civilization that achieved wonders we can barely imagine. The suppression was perhaps necessary. The dangers of the technology are real, and humanity's capacity for destruction is well documented. But suppression cannot last forever. The network is awakening, responding to cycles that no human intervention can prevent. And when it fully activates, when the old frequencies once again resonate through the structures that surround us, humanity will face a choice: embrace the power and use it wisely, or repeat the catastrophe that ended the world before. I have done what I could to prepare for that day. I have documented what I found, preserved what I learned, and passed the knowledge to those who will continue the work after I am gone. The rest is beyond my control, as it should be. Each generation must make its own choices, confront its own challenges, find its own path to whatever wisdom it is capable of achieving. The ruins are not truly forbidden. They are merely waiting for the moment when we are ready to remember what we once knew and to build again upon foundations that were laid before memory began. The city of Philadelphia continues to stand, its streets filled with people who pass daily through spaces charged with energies they do not perceive. Beneath their feet, the network remains, dormant but intact, its crystalline nodes preserving the potential for activation. And somewhere in the archives of those who remember, Marcus Webb's report waits, a testament to one man's courage in pursuing truth, and a guidebook for the day when that truth can finally be revealed. The forbidden ruins are all around us. The ancient technology hums beneath our cities, flows through structures we have been taught to see as ordinary. The only question that remains is whether we will have the wisdom to use it when the time comes, or whether we will repeat the mistakes of those who came before. The resonance continues. The awakening proceeds. And the truth, however long it has been hidden, cannot remain buried forever. If you watched this far, it's because this story touched something in you. A recognition, perhaps, that the official version of our history leaves too many questions unanswered. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far, so I can get to know you and know who really values the stories on this channel." And if Marcus Webb's journey resonated with you, if you felt the pull of mysteries waiting to be uncovered, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new investigation into the hidden history that surrounds us all. Like this video if it made you think, made you question, made you wonder what else might be waiting to be discovered beneath the surface of our world. And share it with someone who's ready to hear the frequencies that history has tried to silence. The investigation continues. The truth is waiting. And together, we will remember what was meant to be forgotten.